In this lecture, we will discuss the P to P and R to R intervals, specifically what they represent and how they can be useful when interpreting EKGs. The P to P and R to R intervals are two common intervals that you will often hear about. Let's go through both of them. The P to P interval represents the time between identical points on two consecutive P waves, okay? So if you look here, we have a P wave here, okay? And then we have a QRS complex, and then we have our T wave, that's the end of the cycle, and our next cycle starts here with another P wave. And we're saying that we have the P to P interval between these two P waves, okay? So we call this a P to P interval. And this is useful in evaluating rhythm abnormalities, such as looking for atrial flutter, second degree AV block Mobitz type 1, which is called Wenckebach, and third degree heart block. Okay, and we'll look at those in upcoming lectures. Now the other interval here is the R to R interval, and this represents the time between R waves of two consecutive QRS complexes. So if you look here, we said we have our first QRS complex, and this is our next one, okay? And of those QRS complexes, this is our R wave, okay? The first positive deflection after our P wave is an R wave. So between the R waves of both cycles, we call that the R to R interval, okay? And this is often used to evaluate regularity of the rhythm. For instance, the rhythm is considered regular if the distance between these R to R intervals is constant throughout, and irregular if it's not. We're going to look at regularity in more detail in upcoming lectures, okay? And we'll also see that this R to R interval can be helpful when we determine the heart rate. Now let's briefly review what we discussed before we end. So we talked about the P to P interval, which is simply represents the time between two identical points. So from this point on the P wave until this point on the P wave between two consecutive P waves. That's the P to P interval. We said this helps in evaluating rhythm abnormalities, okay? And we'll talk about how this is helpful in future lectures when we start looking at these different types of rhythms. And then we talked about the R to R interval. From one R wave to the next R wave is our R to R interval. And this represents the time between two consecutive QRS complexes, specifically the R wave of them. Now this will help us when we determine and looking for regularity of a rhythm. Is it regular, irregular? Then we'll get into, is it regularly irregular or irregularly irregular? Okay, and we'll see how this R to R interval will be helpful when we look at that. Well, that's the end of this lecture. We discussed the P to P and R to R intervals, specifically what they represent and how they can be useful when interpreting EKGs. I hope you learned something.